The European colonization of the world was immense. There are virtually no lands today which did not experience the impact of European colonialism, be it direct conquest and settlement or more indirect influence. Some modern countries that come to mind which largely avoided this are Saudi Arabia, Iran, Thailand, Japan, and of course, China. But history shows us that although these lands were never properly colonized, there was a significant European impact upon them. Japan, for instance, forced itself to westernize militarily and organizationally in order to resist increasing pressure from Europe and America. This westernization proved so effective that Japan even joined the ranks of the imperial powers of the day, rivaling Russia, Britain, and the United States in the Asian Pacific. China is a very different story. European influence truly began to take root in this old imperial power during the reign of the Qing dynasty, a foreign dynasty established by the northeastern Manchu people. The Qing brought China to a new peak of economic might, boasted the largest population on the planet, and reached a geographic size unseen since the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty. Despite this, however, China was lagging far behind the rapidly advancing states of Europe in the fields of technology, tactics, and weaponry, to name a few. The Chinese had hoped to restrict foreign economic influence within China by limiting trade to the single port of Canton and made a further point to import as little from the West as possible, while maximizing its own exports. The European powers, Britain in particular, felt unfairly disadvantaged by China's non-reciprocal trade policies and thus sought to exploit a high-demand market within China: opium. The British had an abundance of opium thanks to their Indian colonies, and many Chinese were willing to pay good money for it. The Chinese government, on the other hand, wasn't so enthused. Opium was an addictive and destructive substance that already poisoned the country, and the last thing they wanted was for China to deplete its reserves of gold and silver to the benefit of these foreigners, while the country was further poisoned. Opium had already been made illegal, but Britain's trade in the substance persisted until finally the Chinese government moved to seize and destroy foreign opium supplies and other products in Canton. Infuriated by this destruction of valuable product without compensation, Britain proceeded to send in naval forces to extract a promise of security for all British citizens within China, including those who may now face serious charges for participating in the opium trade. A formal apology for the destruction of property, compensation for said property, and a lifting of China's trade barriers to allow for a fairer exchange of goods. The Chinese understandably rejected these demands, feeling as though it was Britain who stood in the wrong for perpetuating an illicit trade within China. Thus, war broke out and continued through multiple phases, even after Chinese and British diplomats reached an agreement for China to recompensate Britain and further concessions after that, likely because such concessions were only made with individual officials despite rejection by the emperor. The British advanced by river and found themselves in a position to siege Nanjing, only for peace negotiations to be reopened, and finally the emperor conceded to Britain's victory. Thus, the first of what China refers to as the unequal treaties were signed, granting onto Britain several new privileges, including the colony of Hong Kong, initiating what China recognizes as its century of humiliation. But before going any further, I think you'd really like to hear from today's sponsor. Do you suffer from bad habits or want to start building some good ones? Then folks, Fabulous is the app for you. It's the #1 self-care app to help you build better habits and achieve your goals, and it makes these things all the more fun, almost like you're playing your life as a video game and completing quests throughout your day. You can choose from over 100 preset habits to work on or create your own. Build routines for yourself and get notified when it's time to hit your next goal. Get valuable coaching tips in the morning to help you start your day, and in the evening when you're ready to wind down and go to bed. This is the app to not only build healthy habits, but healthy habits that stick. Backed by the hard work and knowledge of Duke University's Center for Advanced Hindsight, where it was born. This app takes a scientific approach to building positive habits through small and encouraging steps that promote repetition, making excellent use of behavioral study research to make these changes lasting and beneficial. The positive reinforcement and supportive coaching of this app can really help you take those first steps toward progress and even get you to the very end of the finish line. If you're ready to start making a positive change in your life, head down to the description below and follow our link to sign up for the Fabulous app. The first 100 of you to sign up will get a whole 25% off your subscription. Life is too precious to be bogged down by bad habits, and there are so many small changes we could be making to better ourselves every day. So I do insist you all give it a try. Now, back to the video. As time wore on, more nations took from the spoils of the Qing Empire, which had proven itself to be no match for the modernized forces of the West and Japan. The country was in decline, and increasingly tensions were rising, perhaps most evidently ethnic and cultural tensions. Many Han Chinese came to resent the ruling Manchus for what they perceived as holding China back, weakening the country, and corrupting its historic values, when in reality the Manchus were more prone to adopting Han traditions than imposing their own upon the Han population. Though this was the most notable inter-ethnic conflict within the Qing dynasty, it was far from the only one, And that's not even touching upon the multiple religious tensions which existed, such as the several Islamic uprisings which occurred just between the First and Second Opium Wars, and of course the absolutely destructive ethno-religious war that was the Taiping Rebellion between a largely Han Christian population and the Manchu Confucian establishment. These conflicts cumulatively claimed millions of lives, with the greatest bulk of destruction again caused by the Taiping Rebellion. War and concessions continued until finally there was a major lashback in the form of the Boxer Rebellion, when the Chinese citizenry rose up in the form of what essentially amounted to a mass militia for the purpose of expelling the foreign elements which had taken hold of the empire. The Boxers, as they were called, violently attacked and killed foreigners and Chinese Christians alike. They destroyed foreign infrastructure like railroads and communication lines, and spread terror to anyone and everyone who went against Chinese tradition. The Boxers would amass in Beijing where the foreign legations were housed and would proceed to siege the legation quarter for weeks, finally triggering a military response from the nations affected: Britain, Germany, Japan, Russia, the US, France, Italy, and Austro-Hungary. The response of this 8-nation alliance was interpreted by the Chinese government as an invasion, and thus they threw their support behind the Boxers, declaring war on the 8-nation alliance. This decision would prove to be a fatal mistake, as many provinces, predominantly the majority Han Chinese provinces of the southeast, refused to support the Qing declaration of war and instead supported the 8-nation alliance in suppressing Boxer activity. In under a month, the alliance had already captured the city of Tianjin and was making preparations to capture Beijing, which would fall to the alliance just 1 month later. The emperor and empress would be forced to flee inland, and the province surrounding Beijing and Tianjin would see occupation for a full year. Both sides strongly considered a continuation of the war. The alliance recognized the fragmentation and vulnerability of China, most especially now that the government had fled, and the potentially massive territorial concessions that could be extracted. On the other hand, the ruling family considered the Allied victory to be based largely on naval superiority and the result of traitorous elements along the coast, and that by continuing the war in China's interior, the alliance could be exhausted and driven back into the sea. Of course, the alliance was already somewhat exhausted, and the Qing were very uncertain about this potential outcome. The Allied intervention was only meant to relieve the siege on the legation and rescue its endangered citizens, so dragging the conflict out would have demanded a new justification and greater investment. In the end, a compromise was made and minor concessions were extracted from China, most notably a number of measures to prevent groups like the Boxers from ever rising again, and allowing members of the alliance to maintain a military presence in various designated areas. Gradually, European interest would shift away from China and back toward more local affairs, leaving Japan and Russia as the prime contenders for dominance in the East Asian sphere, until Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War and forced their attention back to Europe as well. Though it appeared as though the Qing had survived these years of turmoil and humiliation, the damage had been done, and it would be just roughly 1 decade later that China's imperial system collapsed, giving way to the Chinese Republic, itself plagued by infighting, warlordism, foreign incursions, and more. But what if all that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, China was colonized? A continuation of the Boxer Rebellion into a full-scale conquest of China offers us perhaps the best point of divergence for this scenario. The ethno-cultural divides within China had fully manifested through a southeast Han resistance to Qing rule. The institutions of the Qing Empire had sufficiently eroded to the point that many were willing to accept a change of leadership if it meant an improved quality of life. The capital had fallen, the royal family was on the run, and you had within China the military presence of multiple states with ambitions of extracting territorial concessions. That being said, you also had states with only a minor military presence and who largely participated in the conflict for its original purpose. Italy and Austro-Hungary, for example, each contributed less than 100 men, while the United States would be less enthused with such a colonization effort, but may continue lending support for the sake of securing a beneficial trade concession of some sort. All the while, Russia, Britain, and Germany would almost certainly increase their presence given Russia's proximity and the grand scale of their desired territory, given Germany's ambition of carving out a colonial empire of its own to rival Britain's, and of course Britain's desire to maintain control over the valuable markets it had grown so accustomed to. Japan would also increase their military presence to keep pace with the other 3 powers, and was clearly enthusiastic about the prospect of land concessions as they happened to contribute the greatest share of manpower to the alliance in our timeline. Formal negotiations would officially be made to recognize the Mutual Defense Pact of the Southeast Provinces as the legitimate government of China, which, as its members intended, would be organized as a republic with Viceroy Li Hongzhang serving as president if he lived long enough to serve, Yuan Shikai standing as a likely runner-up if Hongzhang could not serve. The rebellious provinces of Sichuan and Shanxi would also move to officially join the republic, leaving much of the rest of China to be carved up by the alliance post-war. Overestimating the support that they could rally and not accounting for the southeastern provinces actively turning against them, the Qing are ultimately defeated by the forces of Russia, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and the Republic in the span of 2 additional years, and although there is a decent chance that the Qing could temporarily rebound only to collapse some years later, for the sake of this scenario we'll assume that the Allied invasion is a total success. Russia would claim the lands of Inner Mongolia and northern Manchuria while maintaining East Turkestan as a buffer between itself and British Tibet, which would itself act as a buffer should Russia ever attempt to annex East Turkestan into its direct border. Russia and Japan would hold disputed claims over the remainder of Manchuria, thus serving as a catalyst for the potential outbreak of a Russo-Japanese war. To the south of these disputed lands would be Germany's claim over the valuable provinces of Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, and a number of islands and ports along Shandong. Shandong in totality would have provided Germany an unobstructed port with which to easily access its interior lands, but because Shandong belonged to the mutual defense bloc of the southeast, Germany's holdings would be particularly vulnerable to a Chinese, Russian, or Japanese blockade of this natural harbor. And finally, France would receive Yunnan as a natural extension of its Indochina colony. The Republic of China would retain the majority of what has historically been considered China proper and relocate its capital from Beijing to Nanjing. Whether under Li or Yuan, the Republic would adopt a broad policy of modernization that drew inspiration heavily from Britain, Germany, and Japan. A great emphasis would be placed on naval development, railroad construction, and the establishment of military academies that could provide instruction in modern warfare provided primarily by German instructors. Germany would invest heavily in China as a potential ally just as they had in our timeline, now with the added incentive of having China as a reliable ally against a potential Japanese conquest of their colonial lands. China likewise would be thankful to have a partner as powerful and as wealthy as Germany to help stand as a deterrent to Japanese aggression. Knowing well that they could be locked in by Russia, Germany would exploit its superior naval might and begin an expansion of its Pacific fleet to break through a Russian blockade if ever one was established. Germany's true fear, however, was Japan, who was proving itself to be a highly capable naval power which could not easily be overcome as Russia could. The Russians, already in a territorial dispute with Japan, might avoid antagonizing Germany and instead pursue an alliance with them in response to the Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902, in which Britain had agreed to enter into a war on the side of Japan if they were threatened by multiple enemies. In our timeline, Germany had rejected this alliance, seeing little benefit to be gained from it, but in this alternate timeline might perceive such an alliance as a valuable deterrent to Japanese aggression, while also removing the potential threat of Russia annexing Germany's Chinese colony, as this would be the only incentive for the Germans to fight on this front. At the same time, Germany could be expected to establish a mutual defense pact with China to deter Japanese aggression against both of them. This threefold alliance would evoke the triple intervention which previously included France and serve the purpose of reducing Japanese influence in mainland Asia. The combined might of Russia, Germany, and China may also prove sufficient enough to challenge or discourage Britain's intervention, directly preoccupying them in Europe via Germany and in Tibet and India via China. As in our timeline, France had an already established alliance with Russia, and if Russia found itself at war with Japan, it was obligated to join, which consequently meant it would also be at war with Britain. Realizing the dangerous situation they now found themselves in, either reinvigorating the Anglo-French rivalry or siding with the Germans who the French simply did not trust, France would opt out to pursue a rapprochement with Britain, sensing that even if in an alliance with Germany, the Germans would betray them at some point, and to reignite hostilities with Britain would only leave them isolated on the European scene. Thus, the Franco-Anglo-Japanese alliance would be forged, meeting the Russo-Sino-German alliance with imposing capabilities. The Austro-Serbian tensions which led to the outbreak of the Great War would still exist, but given the nature of Russo-German relations, it's unlikely that this would trigger World War I. Rather, the new powder keg would lie in Manchuria and in Korea. The great game between Russia and Britain, the supplanting of France by Germany as the continent's leading land power, the rise of Japan and their need to prove themselves as the dominant power of the East, and now the partition of China have all come together to create the basis for a new world war. One which could very easily go to either side and give us a world in which Germany is the dominant naval power of Asia, Russia has expelled Japan from Korea, and the Republic of China has rebounded at the expense of Britain and France. Alternatively, we could also see a world in which Japan dominates the Asian Pacific, dividing what remains of China with France and Britain, while Germany and Russia fall to decline back home after a long and exhaustive war. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.